Good day, my name is Christian Parente, and today I will be presenting about the short story To Build a Fire by Jack London. So it was written by Jack London in 1902, and then another more famous version was written in 1908 and published by Century Magazine the same year. So basically, the story it goes like this. So a man is walking along a seldom traveled, snow covered trail in the Yukon Territory of northwestern Canada. And he is alone, besides his dog, and he's traveling back home during the middle of a cold snap, which is a time period when it gets very cold as compared to the normal conditions. Um, he believes that the temperature is 50 degrees Fahrenheit below zero, but in reality, it's actually 75 degrees below zero. However, he does not feel endangered at all by this. He feels quite comfortable. Well, he's cold, but he's not afraid at all in any way. Um, and as he's walking, he starts thinking about when he's going to get home and where his boys will be, along with a fire and dinner. Um, he thinks about how it's cold, but it's nothing more than cold. The cold, it bears no significance to him. As he walks through a patch of spruce trees, his beard continues to frost, and his dog follows along, instinctually knowing that it is too cold to travel. But nevertheless, they continue traveling and come to a small stream called Henderson Creek. And while walking alongside the frozen creek, the man is very careful where he steps, not wanting to step into a spring of water that is covered up by the snow. Um, he would periodically stop to think, to make sure that he didn't step in one of these springs, because if he did, it would cause him delay in his mind. Um, and that was because he'd have to stop and build a fire to dry off his feet and his shoes and his wet socks. Um, so once he was unsure of the danger of one of these springs, and so he pushed his dog forward, and the dog broke through the ice and into the water. And the dog got out, but he had to help the dog get out the newly frozen ice off of the dog's legs and toes. Um, and then after this, they kept going, and they made it to the forks of the creek where the man decided he would eat. However, he initially couldn't eat because his fingers were too cold, and his mouth was surrounded by a substantial amount of ice. So he had to build a fire, and then afterwards, after he kind of thawed out a little, he was able to eat. Um, so after the man ate his lunch, which was like a biscuit with some bacon in it, they resumed their traveling. Then out of nowhere, as they're walking along the side of the creek, the man breaks through the snow and ice and wets himself halfway to the knees. Being furious, yet still calm, he gets out of the water and builds a fire underneath the tree. He knew this was imperative, and that he must not fail, because he could get hypothermia, and he could eventually end up freezing to death and losing feeling. So he knew he had to build a fire. As the fire grows, the man thinks he is safe, and he starts smiling about the old timers who had warned him not to go out alone, and he kind of thinks that he's smarter and that he's tougher, and so that's why he's smiling at them, kind of like a haha moment for him. Um, but however, he couldn't feel his feet or fingers, so he had to build a fire. But because he had the fire in his mind, everything was okay. The fire protected him. Then, all of a sudden, a giant pile of snow falls from the tree above him, on top of him and the fire, putting out the fire and putting him in an even more desperate state. Then he attempted to start another fire, but he couldn't because his fingers were numb, and he dropped all the matches in the snow because his hands were also numb. He put on his mittens and scooped up the matches into his lap, where he was able to carry the matches to his teeth. After he did this, he succeeded in getting a match in position and was eventually able to light it, but the brimstone caused him to cough and drop it in the snow. He then picks up all the matches with the heels of his hands, lights Burke Barch on fire, but then he drops the bunch of matches because they were burning his hands. But he did have a tiny fire going, but when he was trying to build it, he broke it apart and it all went out. Knowing that he wasn't going to be able to build a fire because his hands were just not functioning at all, he came up with a new idea. He decided to try to kill his dog so that he could crawl inside of its carcass and survive that way. However, he failed in this attempt also because he didn't have the strength and his hands were too numb to strangle the dog or stab the dog. Realizing his desperate state, the man was afraid and desperately tried to run along the side of the creek to get back to his camp, but he ran out of breath and he fell into the freezing snow. He did this again and he made another wild run, but he fell again, and then he tried it a third time and didn't go too far, and at that point he knew he was going to die, and so he just decided to try to fall asleep, and then he froze to death, and then his dog left him and went off back going in the direction that the man was going, to the camp. So my reaction to this, so starting out, one of the first things that was discussed in the story was like his surroundings, the coldness. Oh my goodness, it was so scary. Like the depiction of the coldness early on in this story, it was scary. Like there's no sun in the sky. It was gray, and like it's such a weird thing to think about, there being no sun in the sky but also no clouds and it's still being gray. Like, ooh, that's scary. The feeling of vulnerability, like the entire story I felt vulnerable and I was in my house and I'm not even out in those conditions. And it was also very, very cold. So I mean, I don't know, I could feel for the man. Like I felt vulnerable. I like the dog versus man contrast. Throughout the entire story, the dog and the man were contrasted. I like that a lot. I really didn't like the man shoving the dog onto the creek surface to test if the creek was strong enough to support their weight. I thought that was really disgusting. And then I like the conflict of the man versus the cold. I thought that was a good conflict because it kept me interested. Like I wanted him to survive, but I didn't know if he was going to. And then the man's attempts to save himself were just pitiful. I felt so bad for him as he was dying. But at the same time, he kind of did it to himself. And then I like how he decided to fall off to sleep and sort of greet death. So moving forward looking at the formal aspects of the text, the genre and rhetorical mode. So prose is primarily used throughout the story, and narration and description are also used. And one example of this narration and description comes from page 834, and it says, "As he turned to go on, he spat speculatively. There was a sharp crackle that startled him." And then the literary techniques, the main one is imagery. An example of that is the frozen mixture of its breathing had settled on its fur and a fine powder of frost, and especially were its jaws, muzzle, and eyelashes whitened by its crystallized breath. So that was a good example of imagery. So, looking at the scope and content, the location, it was in the Yukon Territory in northwestern Canada. And you can see it on the map here, the little blue dot in the red zone on the map on the far left. It occurs 70 miles south of Dawson City, which is located in the central Yukon Basin. So yeah, and that's kind of the best description we get of the location. There's a couple other mile marker descriptions, but that's about it. Looking at the climate, according to Dawson City's official government website, the temperature variations can range from negative 50 degrees Celsius in the winter to 21.5 degrees Celsius in the summer. And translating those to degrees Fahrenheit, that's negative 122 degrees Fahrenheit to 70.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'd imagine that that it's pretty harsh living there. Physical effects. The entire body is susceptible to heat loss, and then especially the hands are susceptible. According to one source, the hands' high surface area to volume ratio predisposes the hand to heat loss, increasing the risk of cold injury and even hypothermia, which are major selective pressures in cold environments. So obviously, the man was putting himself at great danger being in the state he was in. Some other things. It occurs around the late 1890s. There are no cell phones, radios, or lighters. So if the man is in a bad condition, then there's nothing that he could do other than save himself. No one else can save him. And around that time, the Klondike Gold Rush occurred in Dawson, which, as I said before, 70 miles north of the story in 1896 to 1899. So most notable, the imagery in this story was amazing. Everything that the author said, you could see it, and you could see the surroundings around the man. I thought that was very notable. I love the imagery. I like the man's, I guess, bravery at first, because he was not afraid of anything. He kept his cool the entire time. But obviously his initial decision to even go out was foolish. But once he did go out, he did what he could to survive, and he kept his cool. And then the instinct versus judgment conflict. I like how the dog knew what to do better than the man. The dog just knew they shouldn't have been out there, but they were out there anyways because the man judged that it would be okay. So I think the author was kind of just saying, you need to trust your instinct. That was one of the stories, or one of the morals from this story. Moving on to vocabulary. I did not know what any of these words were other than spittle. I kind of could figure out that it was like spit. So conjectural was used in this sentence. It says, and from there it did not lead him to the conjectural field of immortality and the man's place in the universe. So synonyms are theoretical or speculative. And then spittle is just it's just spit basically. And then monotonously is used when the author says, so he continued monotonously to chew tobacco and to increase the size of his beard. And then synonyms are uniform, unvarying, boring, just usual circumstances. And then peremptorily. I have a hard time pronouncing that word. It was used in this sentence. It says, and when he spoke peremptorily with the sound of whiplashes in his voice, the dog rendered its customary allegiance and came to him. So synonyms are domineering and imperious. So yeah, several associated works that I thought of were The Revenant, Castaway, and The Mountain Between Us. I thought of these because they're all they're all survival movies, and The Revenant and The Mountain Between Us both occur in similar settings. The characters have to deal with the cold, and they're in pretty bad shape. And then in Castaway, obviously, Tom Hanks is alone in that as well, so they have to survive So yeah, that's about it.